I am sitting down here today to film the long-awaited how to use my 3D printed sock knitting machine. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel Hella Knits. My name is Julia. I just wanted to give you a bit of an introduction before we get into the video. As you guys know, if you're following along, back at the beginning of 2025, I had hired someone to 3D print all of the plans for this sock knitting machine. It's called the 3D printed CSM for my mom and you by JeepingJohnny on Printables. The entire plan and all of the pieces that you would need to 3D print this machine are available for free online on Printables. It'll all be linked down below for you. There's also an Excel spreadsheet of all of the tools and hardware that you're going to need to put this thing together. If you haven't seen my last videos, I filmed one about assembling this entire thing and another one about assembling the ribber attachment. So if you are also struggling to put yours together, please feel free to check out my previous two videos on this machine. I just want to give you a bit of a disclaimer. This is just how I've sort of figured out how to use this machine. I'm going to go through with you how to knit a tube that you can use to make a sock and sort of the tips and tricks of what I've learned to get this thing to work for me. In terms of the tools that you'll need, I usually have a 3M and a 5M Allen key available to me when I'm using my machine in case I need to make adjustments. In this video I didn't because I've already set it up the way that I like it, but it is handy to have these two around when you're using your machine, especially for the first time. Something else that you will need is a bonnet. A setup bonnet is essentially a knitted tube that you use as a base to get your knitting started on your machine. You can buy these already made and they're essentially just a knitted sock with the loops all the way around. The loops can either be yarn, so they're kind of soft loops, which is what would be suitable for this machine, or they could be metal loops, which would not be suitable for this type of machine, and I explain a little bit as to why in the tutorial. You can also find a pattern to make a bonnet yourself. I will link one down below. I think they're free. There's probably a ton of them out there, but I'll link a couple down below. What I actually use is an old sock. I know, this looks really sketchy. I tied a knot in the end of it and turned it inside out so I could get access to all of the loops and stuff on the back. And I literally just took my little tool, my hook tool that I'll show you in a moment, and I pulled little loops out of it to create a bonnet. I did this just to start because I didn't want to go through the trouble of making or ordering a bonnet, and I realized that this works just fine. So if you have an old sock laying around, I would highly recommend just using that. Honestly, it's a lot easier. But if you want the actual thing, again, I'll link some bonnets for you down below. In addition to your bonnet, you're going to need some weights that go in the bonnet. I also just used something that I had around the house and it seemed to work for me. I literally just use a jar of honey and a candle. These seem to do the trick. They're about the right size to go in the bonnet. I don't know what these weigh off the top of my head, so I'll put it on the screen so you can use that to find something around your house that weighs roughly the same, because you definitely don't want to skimp out on the weights in your sock machine, otherwise you're going to drop stitches like crazy. Something else that might be helpful is a little bit of a clip. So I use this sewing clip. It's pretty strong. You could use an alligator clip, paper clip, whatever. I use this just to hook my very first piece of working yarn onto it and put it underneath my weights in my bonnet to kind of weigh it down. I find that this is the easiest way to do it, but this isn't necessarily essential for using the machine. Finally, you're going to want some hook tools. These tools I got from Angora Valley Fibers, which is a store in the States that sells sock machines and parts for sock machines. I got these from their website. I have two of them and I highly recommend getting a couple different tools, honestly. They have a tiny little crochet hook on one end and then they have a tiny little bar on the other end. I went on their website recently and I actually couldn't see these available, so I don't know if they still sell them, but you could probably get something similar online, like a little crochet hook that's used for embroidery floss, or even like a dental tool or something. This looks kind of similar to that. Find what works best for you. I can put a couple linked down below that might be helpful if this isn't available, but essentially something with a little crochet hook is going to be the most useful for using this machine. Next, you'll need some sock yarn. This is the sock yarn I'm going to be using in today's video. This is Lichen and Lace 80/20 sock. It is an 80% superwash merino, 20% nylon sock yarn, hand dyed in Canada. This is their Amethyst base. I think it's so beautiful. You're going to see shortly how it turns out. You're also going to need some scrap yarn, so literally any scrap yarn will do. As long as it's kind of smooth and roughly a fingering weight, you can literally use whatever you want. One more thing that might be helpful is a yarn bowl. I have a yarn bowl here. This is the yarn bowl that I use. I painted this a while ago with one of my friends. You can use literally whatever you want. I think these machines are meant to be knitted from a cone. I personally don't have any cones, and I also don't have a cone winder, so a yarn bowl is what I use to keep my yarn cake in, because that's what I work from. Keep in mind you will have to pull the yarn and give a lot of slack as you're knitting on your machine, because sometimes when it's from a cake it can get caught when the ball is rolling around, or it can get caught on the little loop of the yarn bowl. You want to make sure you have zero tension on your yarn as it's being thread through the machine. So yeah, that's all I had to say about the tools that you're going to need and a little bit of an intro to this video. I'm going to cut now to me using the machine, and hopefully this tutorial is helpful for all of you sock machine knitters out there. Okay, here I am all set up with my knitting machine here. I'm gonna zoom you in a little bit, but I just wanted to orient you so you guys know what we're working with. If you want to learn more about how to assemble the machine, you can check out my last video. This is the machine all set up. This is the table that I went with. It's a folding table from Canadian Tire. It's honestly nothing special, but it does the job. This is my machine. I've already hooked it up here to my table. I have the 60 stitch cylinder in my machine right now with the ribber stop in it. You can use the cylinder with the ribber stop even if you don't plan on using the ribber, so it's just easier to keep this in. I have needles in every single slot here with a spring around the outside. Here I have my yarn stand at my counter. I wanted to just show you how the yarn is going to be threaded through before we zoom in and look at the actual machine. Okay, so I just have some yarn barf here. Honestly, this is scrap yarn that I unraveled from a previous practice tube, but this will do for our demonstration purposes. When you're ready to start knitting, you're going to want to thread your yarn through your yarn stand. So I have the end of the working yarn here, and I'm going to put it through this hole of the yarn stand. Either one is fine, it honestly doesn't matter. Then through all of the loops here on the yarn stand and down through the end of it like this. So as you're knitting, the yarn will come up and over and back down in through your knitting. So this is how you set up getting everything threaded. This little weight is for doing a heel turn, I believe, so we're not gonna use that today. But yeah, this is the sort of setup that you'll want to do to get started. Okay, so I have you all zoomed in here. It is also incredibly windy outside, so just disregard any wind sounds you might hear. I wanted to go through the tools that you're going to need when you go to knit your sock on your machine. The first thing is called a bonnet. These are basically knitted tubes that have little loops all the way around the edge. You can hook them onto your needles. You start with every other needle, and it basically is used as a way to set up your knitting on the machine. You can make these. There are patterns online, free patterns, which I'll link down below. There are also ones that you can buy pre-made. Some of them have soft loops of yarn, which is suitable for this type of machine where the needle goes all the way down into the channel. Some of them have little metal loops, kind of like on jewelry, that would not be suitable for a machine like this because the metal loop is not going to fit down into the channel. I actually don't have a knitted bonnet. I have a little bit of a makeshift version. This is an old sock that I don't wear anymore. I tied the toe together to make it a little bit shorter, and I went and turned it inside out, and I basically pulled loops of the fabric out to create my own bonnet. I started with this when I was first kind of practicing, and I honestly just haven't had the need to replace it because it's worked so well. So this is the bonnet that I'm going to use. What you're also going to need is some tools. I purchased these from Angora Valley Fibers. These are basically little crochet hooks. They have a bit of a kind of hook on one side and then a crochet hook on the other side, really tiny. So this is helpful for fixing stitches, picking up loops, stuff like that. I have two of them. I recommend having more than one because you're probably going to lose one and they're going to come in really handy. The first thing to do is to set up your bonnet. This is a 60 stitch cylinder. It has the ribber stop in it, but we're not going to use that today. You want to make sure that your machine is all set up so it cranks freely, which this does. If you need to lubricate it, go ahead and do that. Now what you're going to do is use your bonnet. So I've already pulled little strings off of my bonnet. Presumably you would have knitted one or purchased one that's a little bit nicer looking. But what you do is just hook the loops of the bonnet onto every other needle on your machine. And this is where I like to use the hook tool to lift the loops. This technique would essentially be the same for an actual bonnet. So just continue all the way around. Okay, some of my loops are a little bit janky. Honestly, just ignore that. If you had an actual bonnet, it would look a lot better. Once you basically get all of the loops on that you can, then you're gonna thread your yarn in, and you're gonna start with your scrap yarn. So I showed you at the beginning of this video how to thread it through. That's just what I'm doing here. I'm just out of frame. You're gonna take the end of your working yarn. This is your scrap yarn, but it's gonna be your working yarn, and slide it through these holes here on the arm. Now this is where you're gonna put your weights in, and this is where you will see how I use this little clip. So I like to clip the end of the yarn onto a little clip to kind of weigh it down, and then I just throw my weights right down into my bonnet, just like this. Okay. So now my yarn is clipped and it's not going to go anywhere. Like, it's pretty taut here and it's not going to slide out from inside. I'm going to turn on my yarn counter, which is on my stand here, and then you're going to start cranking. You want to make sure that the yarn is coming underneath the angle of the hooks here, okay? So you're going to start cranking just really slowly, and as you can see, I'm cranking along and the yarn is underneath the angle of these little hooks on my machine. Okay, so I'm cranking, and then once I can see that the remaining needles that I hadn't hooked onto my bonnet are popping up, I'm gonna grab my hook tool and I'm gonna continue attaching my bonnet to the rest of these, okay? So I'm just pausing on my cranking and I'm gonna hook up my needles to the bonnet. It's a little trickier because you have the weight in there, but the weight is necessary in order to keep tension on your work. Okay, so I'm going to continue cranking just a little bit more. Okay, and as you're cranking, make sure you're looking to ensure that the yarn is being fed underneath and is being caught on the hooks of your machine. Now I'm going to finish up attaching my bonnet. Okay, so my bonnet is all attached. As you can see, every other needle on my machine is attached to the bonnet. I have the scrap yarn hooked up and weighed down by the weights in the bonnet, and now you can continue cranking. So I'm gonna make sure I'm going nice and slow here, just watching really, really carefully to make sure that my yarn is being caught underneath the hooks. Okay. So now I've completed one round of knitting, and as you can see, the yarn has been picked up by all of the hooks. The spots where the bonnet was attached, you've created a knit stitch here. And on these spots, you've created a loop, which is essentially the same as the loop on the bonnet. So it's kind of like a knit and a yarn over, knit and a yarn over, and now on the next round, we're gonna have entirely knit stitches. And I can see on my counter that I have completed one round. Okay, so I'm gonna continue cranking. And as you're getting started, like really pay attention to how the yarn is being picked up on the needles. So yeah, just continue knitting in the round, and as you go, your weight is going to pull the yarn. It's going to pull your work down to the bottom of the needle so that your work doesn't actually come flying off the needle, if that makes sense. So when I'm doing a sock, I will continue knitting with scrap yarn for roughly 10 or so rounds just to have a good edge that I can work from. And then I'll show you switching into my main yarn. So I'm gonna continue and let you watch as this comes together, and I will switch to my main yarn after about 10 rounds. So as you can see here, I actually have dropped a stitch, so that's perfectly fine. You can see that this piece of yarn did not get picked up. I'll show you how to fix that because this is a common issue that can happen with these machines. What you're gonna do is take your little hook tool and come underneath that loop of the second round, just lift it back up and over the hook. So you're recreating that knit stitch. This is the same concept as if you were fixing a drop stitch in regular hand knitting. You can actually drop stitches if your knitting tension is too tight, or if your weight isn't heavy enough, because essentially both of those things would prevent the yarn from sliding down the needle. As you can see, when I'm knitting, the work is sliding back down to the bottom of the needle. If you don't have a heavy enough weight, your yarn is not gonna slide all the way down, and if your tension is too tight, it's actually gonna be too tight of a stitch to slide all the way down the needle, in which case you're more likely to have the stitch come up and over the top and miss a stitch. So as you can see, I have missed a couple stitches, so I'm going to go ahead and fix that. When you drop a stitch, just pick up the bottom, lift it up and over the needle, and recreate the knit stitch. Sometimes it helps to lift relieve the weight of your bonnet momentarily. Again, this can happen for a number of reasons. I find sometimes it just happens. So things are looking good. Okay, I'm getting to the end of my scrap yarn here. So I'm going to stop just before my counter because I want my counter to accurately pick up how many rounds I've done. So where the magnet for the counter is, that's going to be my beginning of round. Now I'm going to start with my main yarn. So in order to change yarn on this machine, what you're going to do is take this little pick or whatever tool you have, pick a needle, one of the ones that's close to the opening where the yarn is coming out, and pull your working yarn into the middle in between two needles here. Okay, now I have my main yarn just in my yarn bowl. Okay, I'm gonna thread the end of my working yarn through my machine and down, again through the holes on the yarn feeder, and then I'm gonna pull it through in between the same two needles that my scrap yarn is between. So if you can see that, there's a piece of my scrap yarn in between these two needles, and my working yarn is also right next to it. You're going to want to provide some tension on these pieces of yarn. You can do that just with your hand, and you're going to start cranking. Just really pay attention to these needles here. Really pay attention to these needles and make sure that your new working yarn, which is purple in my case, is hooking onto these needles. Now it is going to be a little bit awkward, but you're going to have to provide a little bit of tension on these yarns. You could pull your weight out and tuck the yarn underneath them, but I usually don't do that. So I can see that my yarn is being caught. See, it's been caught into this needle. This is my new yarn, and my old yarn has been caught into this needle here. So we're not missing any stitches. So now that I've cranked past that join, you can see it a little bit better. But this is my scrap yarn hooked onto this needle in a nice knit stitch, and this is my new yarn. So now we're working in the new yarn, which is purple. I don't have to hold tension on these pieces of yarn right this second. And I'm also not holding on to my working yarn at all. It's just coming straight out of a bowl. Okay, so we're knitting all the way around. Now once we get back to the area where the yarn is hanging, we have those two tails, I would recommend providing some more tension on these yarns just to keep the stitches from being too loose and coming off. So I'm holding tension, I'm turning my handle. Make sure that your working yarn loop comes below the level of this little needle flap. Keep tension, really go slowly, and keep an eye on your knitting here. Okay, so that's perfect. Now you can let go of those tails and you can just continue cranking your tube. For the next couple rounds, just really make sure that the two stitches where your tail is nice and even. Sometimes when you're knitting from a cake, you might get a little bit of resistance on the working yarn as it comes out of the bowl. This is probably why it's recommended to knit from a cone, because you never get that resistance. It's all very even tension as it comes off the cone. But even a little bit of resistance on this machine can cause issues with the stitches being uneven or being too tight to fit over the needle, in which case you drop stitches. So just be aware that as you're working, you're not pulling on your working yarn. Don't pull here, don't pull up on the arm, don't pull on the yarn as it's being fed through. If anything, what I do is I will pull yarn out and create a lot of slack for myself as it's being fed through to prevent that from happening. So yeah, at this point you can knit around and around to your desired length. Okay, so I'm just checking in. I've knitted about 40 rounds, so you can see that my knitting, basically as you go, you knit around and your work kind of falls down the center based on the weight. So the weights in your bonnet are going to be what's providing the tension, as well as your tensioner, which is on this side. If you want your stitches to be smaller and tighter, you're going to lift your tensioner up towards the ceiling to make your needles dip only very slightly beneath the top level of this channel. That's going to mean you're pulling less yarn per stitch, so each stitch is smaller. If you want your stitches to be bigger, you're going to bring your tensioner down towards the floor. That's going to mean your needle is pulled quite a bit further down beyond the top of this knitting channel, in which case you're going to be pulling more yarn per stitch and your stitches will be looser and bigger. Right now I have my tensioner kind of in the middle. This is the sweet spot that I find is a good balance between neat stitches and also not too tight that I keep dropping stitches. If you watch my previous videos, you'll have heard that I've had some issues with tension on my machine. Yeah, this is how things are going right now. I'm just going to continue knitting until I am ready to put in some scrap yarn for my heel. So I've knit about 80 rounds of knitting, so my knitting is actually quite a ways down there right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put some yarn on my machine for the heel. So for my heels, I like to do half the stitches worth for the heel. I'm obviously not going to do a heel on here. I know there's an option to do heel turn on this machine. I haven't figured it out yet. So what I like to do is just put a piece of scrap yarn to hold the stitches so that I can pull it out later and knit the heel by hand. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll grab a little piece of scrap yarn. I'm going to knit all the way around to the beginning of round. Right here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to break my working yarn. Obviously you should use scissors. Don't do as I say, not as I do. Do the same thing that we did when we were changing from the scrap yarn to the main yarn, okay? So you're going to pick a stitch, pick a needle. I'm going to pick the exact same one that I did before. Now let me zoom you in so you can see a little bit better. Hopefully you can see this a little bit better. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my little pick. I'm going to pull the working yarn through in between these two needles. Now I'm going to take my scrap yarn, which is a darker color, so hopefully you'll be able to see it better. Taking my scrap yarn, threading it through the yarn mast. You don't necessarily have to do this. This is the end of my yarn. I'm going to feed it through this hole and then through the inner hole. Okay, so the tail of this blue yarn, which is my scrap yarn, is in between both of these needles. So I'm going to continue knitting, but as I continue knitting, I am going to provide some tension here on these two pieces of yarn so that they don't go flying away. So I'm going to start and just really pay attention to these few needles. Make sure that your purple yarn, your working yarn, is caught on this needle, and also make sure that your new yarn is caught on the next needle. So I'm just going to go nice and slow. So as you can see, my previous main yarn was caught in a knit stitch on this needle, which is good. Now my working yarn, my scrap yarn is on this needle and it created a nice knit stitch. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to just knit 30 stitches worth. So this is going to be my heels. So right in between these two stitches, so I'm going to continue knitting all the way around. Okay, so I've gone to 30 stitches. Now what I'm going to do is I broke my scrap yarn and I'm going to pull the tail of the scrap yarn through the needles. So it should be wrapped around 30 stitches. If you know, you know. Having to count 3 times to be sure. So now I have my scrap yarn between 30 needles. I'm going to thread my main yarn back into my machine just the same way that I did before. So I have my main yarn. So you're going to thread it through the arm of the machine just like this. And again, put the yarn tail in between the exact same 2 hooks on your machine. So as you can see, I have the pink tail, which is my scrap yarn, and I have my new yarn here. They're both in between the exact same needles. We're going to run it back. What I'm going to do is reset my counter now, okay? Because now I'm going to be counting, I'm going to knit these socks cuff down, so I'm currently counting for the foot, and I'm going to continue knitting really, really carefully. Pull some tension on the tails of your yarn with your hand, and just make sure that those stitches are caught on the knitting needle. Now you can continue knitting in the round for your foot. I've zoomed you out. Now I'm just going to continue knitting. I prefer to knit my socks with 50 rounds for the foot, so I'm just going to continue knitting. And yeah, at this point, if you followed along so far, you've basically set everything up. You're really well on the way, and you can just chill, watch some YouTube. I'm currently watching The Grocery Girls. Shout out if you guys love The Grocery Girls as much as I do. And yeah, just continue cranking until we go to bind off, and I will check in with you at that point. Okay, so I've now knit 50 rounds since my scrap yarn for the heel. So what I'm going to do now is finish off my sock. I actually grabbed a pair of snips, finally. These are my favorite snips, by the way. They're linked down below. I love them, and they're also very cute. So you're gonna cut your working yarn, pull the yarn out from the yarn stand and set it aside for now. Then you're going to take your scrap yarn. This is, again, Regia sock yarn. It's a different colorway than I used at the beginning. But basically the whole idea is to knit another 10 or so rounds of scrap yarn before you bind off, because then you have some wiggle room. You can pull it out, reuse it, and pick up the stitches to knit your toe. So I'm threading my yarn through my yarn mast here, all the way down through. So this is my scrap yarn here, this pink. What you're going to do is take your little tool, pull the working yarn in between two stitches, and just as I had said before, you're going to thread your scrap yarn through the yarn feeder. Hold the tail in between those exact same stitches. Provide some tension here just with your hand, and really pay attention to these stitches and just knit slowly. Okay, so it looks like I did drop a stitch, which is fine. It's totally fine. I'm going to continue knitting just a little bit so the needle can come up and you guys can see what happened. So as you can see, I actually dropped a stitch, and I think that was because I wasn't providing enough tension on this yarn here, but that's fine. That's what this tool is for. So what I'm going to do is relieve the tension on my knitting. So I'm just lifting it up from underneath the table. All you want to do is pick up that stitch with your tool and re-hook it back onto the needle. Okay. So I've caught my knitting here. You basically just have to re-knit it as you would hand knitting. First stitch, second stitch. Okay. Now it looks like my tail didn't catch on this needle, so I'm actually going to pull my tail through just like this and hook that onto my needle. I really hope you were able to see that, and that kind of made sense. So basically, I think what happened is my tail of my working yarn didn't catch on this needle, which is totally fine. Now that we've got that all sorted, I will zoom you out a little bit. Now I'm going to knit about 10 rounds in my scrap yarn for the end of my sock. So I'm going to reset my stitch counter. When I get to this part, I really want to provide some tension on my needles, on my yarn, sorry, to make sure those stitches are picked up, which it looks like they are, which is great. And that's what we want. See how the stitches are picked up again? I've now knit 10 rounds of scrap yarn, and this is the end of my sock. If you had a bigger machine, you could continue and put your main yarn back on and knit the second sock, but at this point my bonnet is touching the floor, so it's time for me to cast this off. So what you're going to do is cut your working yarn. This is a lot simpler than you might think. Because this is scrap, I'm not too worried about all of this unraveling. I have 10 rounds. Now, I don't know if this is the proper way to do it, you guys, but this is what I do. So I cut my working yarn. I'm just gonna pull it back through the beginning of my round. Just leave it hanging there, and you knit an entire round and it's all gonna come off, okay? So just knit all the way around. See how it comes right off the needles? Bam! Okay, so now I'm gonna pull this all the way out, and this is what I have created. How awesome is this? Hopefully you can see that. When you're all done, you can pick up the stitches on your heel to knit the heel, and then you can pick up the stitches around the toe, pull out the yarn that you used for scrap, and knit the toe. You can also, so this is the scrap yarn that I had at the beginning. You can cut this and pick it up to knit your cuff, however you want to do your cuff. Alright, so that was the tutorial. I went ahead and I made the second tube off camera, so I currently have 2 sock tubes here. I used, as I said, the 60 stitch machine, and I used 30 stitches on scrap yarn for the heel. I knitted these legs quite a bit longer than my other socks. I actually did 80 rounds. Previously I'd only done around 60, and I found the socks just to be a little bit too short, so I thought I would make them longer, and I have plenty of yarn left over. So these are the 2 tubes that I am left with. They're exactly the same. This is what it turns out like. The fabric with the tension that I had is honestly really nice. As you can see, it has some nice stitch definition, but it's not too gapey and holey, which is really nice. I can measure my gauge and put it on the screen for you guys to tell you what gauge I got for these socks. Because everyone's tensioner is going to be adjusted to a slightly different height, your gauge might not be exactly the same as mine, but hopefully this gives you a bit of a reference. So essentially, once you get to this point, you've conquered the hardest part, which is making the tube on your machine. What you're going to want to do is create sort of an afterthought heel. So you basically just pick up the stitches along either side of the scrap yarn that you've inserted into your tube and knit the heel as you usually would. You can use any heel construction that you want. Do the same on the other side. Then for the toe, it's pretty much the same deal. You pick up the stitches, you pull out the scrap yarn, and you do some decreases for a nice toe. And again, for the cuff, you can do whatever you want for this cuff. Today, I didn't use the ribber on my machine. I just wanted to show you how to do a plain stockinette tube. But of course, if you wanted to do your cuff on your machine, you could do some ribbing, then transition to stockinette, and then just do your bind off on hand knitted needles. I hope all of this made sense to you guys, and I hope that this video was helpful for all of you out there who are using your sock machine or just built one and trying to figure it out. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave them down below in the comments. All of the tools and equipment I used for this machine and for using it will be linked down below as well. If you haven't already, please check out my previous 2 videos on this sock machine, how to build the main machine and how to build the ribber attachment. If you have any other questions, there's a full set of instructions on how to build the machine on the Printables page. Shout out JeepingJohnny for posting this entire plan for free, available online on Printables. I think that's it. I hope this video was helpful, and I can't wait to see you in my next one. Bye!